Hi everybody, it's another day in my messy basement, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the most underrated 35mm SLR you can buy on eBay or anywhere. The Minolta Maxxum 7, A7, and Dynax 7, depending on where the camera was originally sold. Now this was essentially a mid-range prosumer SLR, or more towards the top of that, below the Pro model. So this was kind of competing with the Nikon F100. I don't know what Canon it competed with because I don't know anything about Canons, nor do I care to. But the Minolta A7 was essentially like the Nikon F100, and it competed with that. But it was this very advanced film SLR that's pretty much on the level of, say, a Nikon F5 or even F6. And it can be had for just, well, it depends on where you look. You can pick this thing up for like 100 to 150 bucks on eBay, at least of the time this video is going up. And you can pick it up for a bit less if you know where to look or know where to import one from Japan, essentially. But if you pick one of these up, it'll be kind of worth it if it works. And I'll explain what I mean by that later in the video. So let's take a look at this camera and what it is and what makes this camera so great. So this is a Minolta A7 or Alpha 7. The Alpha means it was sold in Japan, while Maxxum was sold in America and Dynax was sold in Europe. And the A7 would be, the A is the branding that Sony would use. They would use the Alpha logo but designed differently and more like an A. And they would use that Alpha logo when selling these SLRs that they made worldwide, which were all digital SLRs, until they replaced them with the mirrorless cameras, which they have an adapter for this mount, which is called the A mount, or Minolta AF. And there's body caps that say Minolta or Sony. They're interchangeable. So as you can see, this is the pentaprism and the mirror and everything. It's an A mount. And so what this mount is it has a autofocus motor here, and you can just set it to single, automatic, continuous, depending on what this is set to. So on the Minolta mount, you'll notice that the autofocus motor stays down when you push the button, and that's because the motor actually pops right up when you change it, and I'll show you this when I turn the camera on. When you change it, it pops up if it's an autofocus lens, which is cool. Depth of field preview, nice feature to have. Even the Maxxum 5 has it though. So we've got our autofocus switch here, the mount. I'm going to put the cap back on before so I don't get too much dust in here. And so this turns clockwise like most mounts do, unlike Nikon, which turns counterclockwise. So here's the cool part of it already, the menus. So we've got two dials, which a lot of cameras have these days, and a lot of them still had, even back then, like the F5. But here's what's nice. We've got PASM as a dedicated knob, full auto P, and then 3 custom settings. And you can actually reconfigure one of them to be a special mode only this camera has. We've got our exposure compensation dial. And right here we've got a flash compensation dial, I think. And we've got our auto exposure lock here. I think this is something to do with like shutter release images, something like that with taking images. I think this might do multiple exposure, timing and stuff. I need to read up on the manual because this thing has like a 150 to 200 page manual. That's how complicated and advanced this camera is. It has a 150 to 200 page manual. We've got our sensor down here for eye autofocus because it kicks on the autofocus when you put your eye next to it. A display option setting and a backlight setting. Several different autofocus grid settings. And then you flip this down here and you see dating and printing, ISO settings, data settings, and I'll show you this in a second. Some Japanese text I think that has to do with settings. I'll have to look what it is in the manual because when you get a Japanese version, you get Japanese text like that. And we're going to pop this back here. And it's pretty much like you'd expect for a 35mm camera, except there's one notable difference, and that is there's 2 sets of DX sensors. And what this will do is it'll actually count how many frames the film can take, And when you get to 36, what happens is it automatically rewinds it. I think it's to reduce wear on the motor or make sure you get exactly 36. It has infrared film counting like a lot of these cameras do. And also, it has an imprinting back, because this camera will imprint stuff in there if you tell it to. I don't think it can do it between frames like some of the Nikon or even some of the other Minolta backs can do. I think it's only on the print itself, unfortunately. I need to really read into this. And then there's an iStart switch. I have it turned off because it likes to trigger very easily. And we've got our AFMF toggle, which lets you essentially tell it to start focusing, and then you could just turn the lens. Well, actually, you just push it down there, it changes to manual just to override it, kind of like what Canon would let you do. That's what I've heard it was a ripoff of. And here it's just a display that mostly tells you the exposure stuff, but it's very small. And that's deliberate. And that's because it's all done on this display back here. Let's put a lens on and I'll show you what I mean by this. So let's take the body cap off. Let's take the back cap off here. How do I get this off? Oh boy. How to use two hands. So this is a kit lens from about probably the SI era. So it says 1993 Minolta, so probably the late XI or the SI era. Definitely one of the two. And we're going to bolt this lens here. And it's like you would a typical lens mount. You do it, turn it. And as you can see, it's loose until we turn the camera on. And then it's going to kick in and it's going to go stable. In fact, I'll even show you how it turns on. A lot of Minoltas do this. I know the SIs and the 5, the 7 and stuff do this. And it engages the autofocus. And when you turn it off, it turns it to infinity to take up less space in your bag. Now, unfortunately, this LCD is a bit worn out, and that's because this LCD essentially, because this camera was in Japan, the polarizer has been kind of flaking off, or at least detaching from the middle, so this has happened. So we take this off. Let me just take this lens camera off. And as you can see, we've got ourselves in here a nice little display. It's hard to see because of how this is, but we've got ourselves a nice little inverted LCD display of like exposure settings and what we have it set to. So this is in program mode, and as we can see, oh boy, it came off. So what we can see here is that it's not in focus, but if we turn it one way or the other, it actually changes the mode it's in. It'll change it to essentially a weird sort of shutter priority or aperture priority, and it depends on which knob you turn. If you turn this knob, and these are the other display options. If you turn this knob, the one on the top, it turns aperture, and the other one changes shutter at priority. But it's not really a priority mode, it's just a program mode. And if we push this button here, it acts as a panic button and sends us back to regular P. We can also choose aperture priority, shutter priority, and full manual. And we can change it all with the knobs, and when you have it in full manual, what happens is you basically see essentially how high you're over or under exposing it, which is really nice, because you can basically get full control over it. But that's not the only cool control part. If we push AE lock and then we push display, we actually see a honeycomb of exactly how much it's over or under exposing. Cool feature. See that? But here's the other cool feature with this menu system. The first one is data. And so what we're going to do is we're going to push this, toggle it again. We're going to go to data, and we can actually go here and look at, read out our old film rolls. So we can push adjust, and so we can see every single shot, what time, the date on each roll. So this was a ISO 100 roll, and then if I go to here, data, go to 2, I can actually read what these shots were on this roll. So they were much higher because it's 400 film instead of 100. I was shooting Nectar 100 in this thing, and then I shot a roll of Fuji 400, which I have no idea when it expired. As we can see what they were on each shot, which is really cool. Here's another cool feature. Custom. You see this? If you push this button, display, you can choose exactly which option you want. That tells you, and then you can just push it to change it right away. But see, you can choose all these features. And there's a lot of cool features that you can change with this camera. It's very customizable, and it even tells you what it's doing. Very nice camera. There's a lot of cool features, like if you turn it this way, well, it's supposed to film is not, look at this. Refer to custom number 5 to change. So we have to go to custom 5, and we have to turn it to 1, and then we can shoot, if it focuses, I can shoot it. And if I go to display, I can see other views for the readout. I can choose this, one with less info, a meter that tells me how much I'm over or under exposing it. If I change it to P, then it tells me that. There's also another mode if you change the settings called STF mode. And what it does is, let's see if I can focus it. Take 7 pictures with something changed to essentially mimic an STF lens, which was this nice bokeh, I think that's what it's called, lens made by Minolta and then Sony, which is a very quirky feature of this camera. And so the other thing you see is when I change it here, I can see the last few times I fired the shutter, both if there was film in it or if there was no film in it. Like the last 5 will show up along with your current exposure when you have it set to that. Really cool feature without having to go to the data menu. So yeah, and also here you can also see your exposure settings and whatnot. So like 24.5, it doesn't display how much film you have because that displays back here. And here's the fun part, if you shoot like film on here and get to the end of the roll, it will actually advance it and tell you to remove the film on the back. Very cool camera. So why is this camera a little bit underrated, and why do some people avoid this camera? Well, there's several reasons. The first is the lens selection for the Minolta mount is kind of dodgy to some extent. Now, if you want a database of all the Minolta and third-party lenses, you can go to dyxum.com, dyxum.com, and they've got a whole database with reviews of every Minolta A-mount lens for the most part. So you can pick up some really good lenses, but there's some good lenses on this mount, there's some really terrible, crummy lenses on this mount. Not everything's perfect. Second problem, this infamous flash mount, which Minolta used and is called proprietary even though it's some standard that nobody else but Minolta used. Crazy, right? How does this even go back on? And so that hot shoe drove a lot of people crazy. And it's crazy, right? Alright, so let's talk about the problems with this camera other than the one mine has with the LCD, which is mostly a Japanese thing. And this LCD issue is, it's technically called vinegar syndrome when it happens to a color display, but the polarizer and the screen develop an issue, and then you basically have to replace the polarizer, where you kind of have to rip into this, and there isn't really a good service manual online posted for this, just a parts manual with the disassembled diagram of this. So it's kind of a little hard and frustrating to work on these. But, you know, at least a manual exists, because with a lot of these Minolta cameras, there's not even a service manual for a lot of Maxxums, like the 9XI lacks one. Many of the XIs do. I don't even know if there's even an XI service manual scanned. Some of the SIs do as well. There's a bunch of Minoltas that just don't have service manuals posted, which is frustrating. But let's take a little look at this real quick. So there's two main problems that most people have with these cameras. The first is that this latch breaks, because apparently this latch is a flimsy design, and with heavy use, the latch will eventually break off. And that's not something you want to happen on a film camera. This isn't just a Minolta issue. The Nikon 6006 and a few others of that vintage have the same issue with the latch breaking off. And then there's also, I think, a few other cameras with the latch breaking off. So, unfortunately, it's not too uncommon in film cameras. The second problem is I think in the base plate or somewhere in the mirror box, there's an aperture gear that goes. Because it's a plastic gear, and what happens is the gear fails, the camera detects this and says, hey, there's something not right, and it throws an error message and essentially locks the camera until you reset it. And then if it's an actual failure and not just a gear on the verge of failing, eventually the camera will quit working, and you have to replace the gear. Which, it's kind of like on those Pentax ZX series cameras, where I think I've got one right here to show you what I'm talking about. You know, with the infamous mirror problem, the whir of death, if you know what that is. With the infamous mirror problem, because the mirror eventually, the gear breaks and the mirror gets stuck up or in some weird spot. It's a little like that. It's not exactly like that, but if you know what I mean, it's kind of like that. But there's a gear that breaks, and it's plastic, and it has to be replaced. And it seems to be not as common as that Pentax gear failure is, because with the Pentax, those gears were failing when this was under warranty, and it was such a bad problem, they moved to a metal gear. While with this Maxxum 7, some of them might have failed. I think there were people talking about having hassles getting this thing fixed from Konica Minolta and Minolta back in the day, but the thing is, eventually Sony bought Minolta, and the part supply for these cameras dried up. So if one of these breaks in another way, which isn't just like replace a gear, you're kind of out of luck. You have to find another A7 body. It's not like where Nikon, where they produced and had stockpiles of them for years, and because they pulled out of the camera business in 2006. And so, unfortunately, getting parts and service manuals for these Minoltas is kind of a pain, especially if nobody's scanned one in before. But if you do want help on messing with these cameras or any issues, there's a website called dyxum.com, dyxum.com, link in the description, and they're much better than any dodgy Discord server or subreddit when it comes to getting help for these, because a lot of these people, you know, congregate on this forum, and there's a lot of people who've had these for years, and they know who to talk to, and they know what to do. So, very knowledgeable people, very helpful forum, no drama. No stupid Discord drama, if you know exactly what I'm talking about with any Discord server. That should tell you everything. dyxum.com. Go on there, and if you need help or want to share photos you took with one of these cameras, great site for that, along with Sony Alphas. There's a flash here too. I should add too, there's one very important thing this camera can do, and I can't believe I didn't mention it this whole video. The Minolta AS7, along with the Maxxum 5, the Maxxum 4, the 3, and also the 50 and 70 can autofocus Sony SSM lenses, unlike some of these older Maxxums like the Maxxum 9 or pretty much anything before that. Because the Maxxum 9, it can if you get a conversion, which you can't get anymore. And so the converted bodies go for like $500 to $700, $1,000, but this thing is only maybe $50 to $100 if on the cheap end, and then $100 to $150 for the nicer ones. And then for the Maxxum 5, you can find those for $20 at Shop Goodwill if you really want to use those lenses. I should talk about the Maxxum 5 one day, because it's also a good camera, but I shot this thing out in, you know, kind of dodgy weather. The autofocus worked every time, and I got some great pictures from it. Of course, you know, if it was raining more, I probably should have used like an f5 or an A9XI or something, and even then, moisture might have gotten into the lens still. Didn't get into this lens, thankfully, but what else can I say? These cameras are great for what they are. I mean, it's better than an f100 at the same price, I'd say. It's just, I hope you have Minolta autofocus lenses, because if you try to adapt another lens to this mount, it's not going to give you any focus confirmation, period. So, but still, not a bad camera. Pick one up if you're interested in cameras like this, like autofocus cameras, and you want something that's essentially the best you can get for film, because that's what this is. It's the most underrated film camera ever made. So that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more, and if you want more info on these cameras and want to discuss them, visit Dynax.com.